Thank you for coming to our presentation. So our speaker for today is Dr. Chris Jones, and he is the Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Washburn University. So if we could give them a nice warm welcome.
Michelle, I like that you said the Assistant Professor of Religious Studies because that's not actually a misnomer. I am the only professor of religion at Washburn University. So I like to say in my program, there's me and then there's God. I am the only professor of religion at Washburn University. And so I say that to give you a bit of a caveat to start out here today. I am not an expert in every religion that I talk about. By training, I am what's called a Semitic philologist. And what that means is that I study ancient Semitic texts, mainly texts written in Hebrew, Jewish texts. My expertise is ancient Judaism. I'm going to be talking today about Native American religions, Islam, and Buddhism. So apologies in advance for all the things I don't know about those traditions. I will talk for a while, and then I will invite your questions. And so I hope that you will have some questions, and if I can answer them, I will. And if I can't, I will direct you to Wikipedia, if that's okay. And you can drill down from there. All right, you doing okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and get started then. So, hello.
I think your computer went to sleep.
Oh, okay, there we go. All right, wakey. I know, nobody wants to be awake right now, but we're going to do it. All right, slideshow mode. So, the talk I was directed to give was on world religions here in Kansas, religious diversity here in Kansas. And so I want to first point out, I had a little, it's not a logo, marketing was very clear about that at Washburn, it's not a logo, but I had a little picture made to signify how I view our work as scholars of religion in the state of Kansas. I wanted to get symbols representing different religions of the world superimposed on a sunflower, because I feel like to study religion in Kansas, you might assume that you just study different kinds of Christian. What kind of Christian are you? What kind of Christian are you? You're Protestant. You're evangelical Protestant. You're Reformed evangelical Protestant. Ooh, that's snazzy. You know, like we think that Kansas is just this big white rectangle in the middle of America, and it's really not. Kansas is actually pretty diverse. There's a lot of different religions represented in Kansas, and we don't have to go very far to encounter people who have wildly different beliefs from each other. And so what I want to talk about is different people you might encounter, different people you might meet, and how to do the Kansas thing, which is how to be nice to them. Because in the Midwest, there's nothing we're better at than being nice to people. And I feel like most of the problems that we run into are not problems of intent, we just don't always know how to be nice. And so I want to talk about how to be nice to people regardless of their background. And I want to give you some background on where different people come from to give you a sense of what it might look like to be nice to them, okay? So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about one thing, and it is a very simple proposition. And the simple proposition is this, that knowing what religion somebody is tells you literally nothing about them. So I have superimposed here on this slide two different Christian communities. I have a Catholic Christian community from New York, and I have an African-American Pentecostal community in the Deep South. And if you grew up in the United States, if you're familiar with American culture, it is no surprise to you at all that both of these communities are Christian. And you're already aware that even though they're both Christians, they're very different from each other. They have different worship styles. The Catholic Church in New York, they tend to kneel, they tend to be quiet, they tend to go in unison, they tend to be liturgical and ordered and structured. The African-American congregation in the South tends to be very unordered, very unruly. People dance in mouths, people throw their hands up, people shout, people talk back to the preacher. These are both absolutely normal, typical, acceptable, legitimate ways to be Christian. And in the United States, because we are immersed in a Christian culture, nobody has any real problem understanding that. But, at least when I talk to my students at Washburn, they're always surprised to learn that other religions also have that level of diversity. That knowing that somebody is Muslim, knowing that somebody is Hindu, knowing that somebody is a Yoruba practitioner or a Voodoo practitioner, knowing that somebody is Constable, knowing that somebody practices Native American traditional religions, also doesn't tell you anything about them because they could practice that in any number of ways. So as an example of that, I want to show you a couple of pictures of Muslim women. Now, one of these pictures probably looks like many of us would expect Muslim women to look. Covered from head to toe, in a chador and in a niqab, right? The other picture is also of Muslim women. These are women in Egypt, and they are protesting sexual assault in Egypt. and they do not wear coverings. They wear Western dress. And so I just want to point out again that these are both examples of people practicing the same religion. And for many people in the West, and myself included at times, we're surprised by that. We expect people to all be the same when they practice something we're not familiar with. And so my initial proposition, the thing I want to say at the outset, is what I just said. Knowing somebody's religion tells you literally nothing about them. There is no substitute for getting to know the person, for encountering the person, engaging the person, finding out who they really are, what really drives them, how their religiosity intersects with everything else about them. Class and race and ethnicity and background and gender and experience and everything else about them. So that's our initial proposition. And from that, I want to move on. I want to talk about different religions we encounter in Kansas, okay? So this is a breakdown from Pew Research, probably the best polling company in America. And this is a breakdown of percentages of different religions encountered in the state of Kansas. And not surprisingly, Kansas is about 75% Christian, at least among those who practice religion. That means 31% evangelical Protestants, 24% mainline Protestants, 18% Catholic, small percentages of other groups of Christians, and then other religions break down into predominantly less than 1%. There are small but significant Muslim populations. On Tuesday, I invited the Imam of the Topeka Mosque to come and visit my world religions class. We have several hundred Muslims who practice in Topeka. I believe there are many hundreds here in Manhattan as well. There is a small but significant Buddhist population. There is a Buddhist Sangha in, where is it? Junction City? It's out here. Anyway, there is a Buddhist monastery there. There's one in Kansas City across the border, but still within range of Kansas. And others as well. And then 20% of Kansans identify as nuns, not like convent nuns, but like religious nuns, people who don't practice any religion, atheist, agnostic, and undefined. And so Kansas is a religiously diverse place. Even though there is a majority of Christians, Kansas is religiously diverse. So one thing that is not recorded here, and I'm not sure why, but I want to talk about it briefly, just briefly. One thing that's not recorded here is Native Americans. There are 4 different Native American reservations in the state of Kansas, or that exist within the state of Kansas. And Native American tribes often practice traditional religions either in addition to or alongside of or in substitution to other religions present in the U.S. And so I want to talk briefly about that. So there are, 4 different tribes that exist within the state of Kansas: the Iowa, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, and the Sac and Fox. And I'm not an expert on Native American spirituality, but I can tell you a few things about Native American religion. One of them is that much of traditional Native American religion is lost to us because of colonialism and because of American education. When the American government attempted to take over Native American lands, when Native Americans were driven out of lands, they were often forced into schooling run by the U.S. government. And that schooling typically taught them to experience their own culture as shameful and backward and tried to strip them of their culture, tried to make them white and Christian. And so much of the traditional religious forms were lost, and many of them were synthesized together. And so today, many different Native American tribes practice similar forms of spirituality because they're attempting to re-synthesize what was lost to the colonial heritage of the American takeover. And so I just want to talk about one symbol that sort of runs through many Native American tribes, and in particular, the Iowa, who are related to the Lakota, the Sioux. And this is the Wakantanga, and it is represented as a circle. There are different names for it. Wakantanga reflects the belief that the world is essentially mysterious, that the sacred power, it's often translated as Great Spirit, but that's really a misnomer because the Lakota are not monotheistic. There is no one Great Spirit. A better translation is probably Great Mystery. And it expresses the idea that the world is endless. It's round, it's a circle, it has no beginning or end. And it's essentially mysterious. Things happen for reasons we can't fathom, but there's great power in that. And if you can harness that power through ritual, you can live a better life. And so this is one example of Native American spirituality that is often lost and often not talked about in even like a world religions class. And so I want to just briefly address that. Are there any questions so far? I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Not so much question as it is, I know because I kind of went off on my own kind of study of trying to like understand people of different faiths. And there's another large one here in Kansas that I don't think is talked about as well as those who practice northern paganism.
Oh, yeah.
So like more along the lines of like the Viking deities and stuff.
Yeah. That wasn't polled. Yeah. But yeah, Wicca. So neo-paganism. No, this is different. Okay, yeah. Thank you. This is different.
Yeah.
I guess I lump Wicca with other forms of neo-paganism, but they are separate, distinct traditions.
The ones who deal more with northern paganism are more along the lines of like the old, like Odin, Thor, the Great World Tree, stuff like that. And there actually is a conference they have every year called Light Across the Plains that they come together.
I did not know that was prevalent specifically in Kansas. Yeah. That's really interesting. Thank you. Actually, there's a bit of a connection here. I have a couple of students at Washburn who were after me to offer a class on comparative paganism, and I had no background in paganism, so I'm going to have to learn a lot, but I'm going to offer this class. So it's really helpful to know that there is a community here in Kansas.
And they're two separate Wicca and paganism is a lot different.
Yeah, hence comparative paganism. We want to talk about different forms of non-monotheistic religion. Religions that don't have a single deity, and religions that practice rituals that connect them to different deities. Thank you very much. It's really helpful. Other questions? Yes, please.
On your form you had earlier, you don't have the Native American church listed because most of the Native Americans fall in that 20%.
Okay. So
because you're not putting the Native American church up there, and that's what the majority of them belong to here in Kansas.
Okay, so like when polled, they would perhaps identify as nuns?
Yeah, they put nothing particular.
Yeah.
Because they don't discuss their religion outside of the tribes.
Yeah. And that's why it's hard.
The Native American church meets in Topeka in traditional language. Every, can't remember if it's Saturday night or Sunday night.
That's great. Thank you. That's helpful to know. Again, it's
just off of First Street. They use one of the Christian churches.
Okay. That's actually really good to know. I'm new to Kansas as well, so. Any questions about Semitic philology? Just kidding. No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. It's really good to know that. Yeah. Anything else? Then let's talk about Islam. So I want to talk a bit about Islam and then Buddhism as two different examples of very different religious traditions that are present in Kansas and that sort of have very different orientations toward the cosmos. So Islam, there's about 1 billion Muslims in the world. Anybody know, what is the largest Muslim country in the world, the country with the most Muslims? Indonesia. Nobody ever gets that. Bingo. Awesome. Indonesia is the the largest Muslim country in the world. I believe, if memory serves, number 2 is Bangladesh. Number 3 is either India or Pakistan. They are back and forth. You don't get to the Middle East until, I think, 8, 9, or 10, if you go down the line. And so most of the world's Muslims do not live in the Middle East. In the United States, we hear much, much more about the Middle East because of the political engagement between the West and the Middle East. And because Islam originates there. But Islam is a global tradition, and most of the world's Muslims are not Arab and not located in the Arabian Peninsula. So Islam, as a religion, is founded on what people call the 5 pillars. Who's heard of the 5 pillars of Islam? Okay, so we have some background here. Good. So Islam, as a tradition, is founded on the 5 pillars, the 5 central teachings. And so the first pillar of Islam, the testimony of faith, number 1 up there, also known as the Shahada, or the Shahadah, depending on how you pronounce it. And this is a profession. You become a Muslim by professing a single sentence in a proper context. And the profession is this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And the reason that is so intrinsic to Islam is because it says the 2 things that Muslims believe that make Islam distinctive. First of all, monotheism. Islam is rigorously monotheistic. There is no God but God. And bear in mind, Allah is not another name for a different God. Allah is just Arabic for God. In fact, it's related to the Hebrew. Semitic philology, let me get into the weeds here a little bit, okay? So in Arabic, al is the definite article, the, and ilah is the word for God. The Hebrew word for God is El. So maybe you've heard like El Shaddai. means God Most High, El Shaddai. Same basic word. So the Arabic word for God, al-ilah, gets, what's the word for it? Conjunction. It gets contracted, there's the word, contracted to Allah. Christians in the Middle East who speak Arabic call the Christian God Allah, because they're speaking Arabic. So Allah is just the Arabic word for God. The point is not that there is no God but this one particular God, it's that there is only one God. There is no God but Allah. And Muhammad is his prophet. And this is what distinguishes Muslims from Jews and Christians. Jews and Christians could also say, well, there is no God but our God. But for Jews and Christians, God is revealed in different ways. God is revealed through the Hebrew scriptures for Jews. God is revealed ultimately in Christ for Christians, and in the Bible for Christians. For Muslims, God is ultimately revealed through the Prophet Muhammad. And we'll talk about that a little bit more down the line, but that is central to Islam. So the other pillars sort of surround that first pillar, the testimony of faith. And so prayer. According to Islam, you're supposed to pray 5 times daily. And when you pray, you're supposed to orient your body toward Mecca, which is where Islam was founded, where the Kaaba, the most sacred site in Islam, is located. And so when you think about how to be Muslim in different parts of the world, if you live in a Muslim-majority country like Saudi Arabia or Indonesia or any number of examples, life is oriented around the 5 daily prayers. So when it's prayer time, the adhan goes off over the loudspeakers. That's the Arabic chanting that announces it's time to pray. And literally everything stops. And everybody gets down to pray. And they point their bodies toward Mecca, and they go to their knees, and they go to their foreheads, and they pray. And it's easy to do that because everybody's doing it with you. If you live in the United States, and you are a Muslim who prays 5 times daily, you have to stop everything 5 times a day, while everybody else keeps doing things in order for you to pray. So, for instance, one of my colleagues at Augustana College, my previous institution, is Iranian and Muslim and practicing. And so we flew, process this, we flew together to a conference a couple of years ago, and at the airport, he would stop to pray at regular prayer time. So here is a brown Muslim man at an American airport doing a distinctly Muslim thing out in the open. That takes guts. That takes courage. Americans get scared, irrationally scared of that. And I had such admiration for the willingness to, don't do that. I had admiration for the willingness to, okay, I'm seeing a screen here. I know, I feel slow today too. So, thinking about this in the context of a university, right? Like, how do you create spaces for Muslim students who need to pray 5 times a day to do that with discretion, without fear of harassment, without undue inconvenience? So like for professors, you have to be willing to let students get up and walk out of class 5 times a day if prayer time falls during class time. For people in the union, you have to be aware that people may need places to pray. And I don't know if there is a space on campus that is set aside for Muslim prayer. Washburn sadly does not have anything yet. I'm working with the MSA there to try to get something. But that's something to be thinking about. That's something to be aware of, that this is a need that Muslim students have. So for instance, at Washburn, we have a chapel. Now, we are a public institution governed by the First Amendment. We are non-sectarian. We're not Christian. Our chapel has no religious iconography whatsoever, of course, because that would be a violation of the First Amendment, but it has pews. Now, pews are not distinctly Christian, but pews are pretty Christian. Why can't Muslims use our chapel for their prayer services? Because when Muslims pray, they don't sit. They kneel and prostrate themselves. The pews get in the way. So we have a non-sectarian chapel that is useless mostly to non-Christians. That's a problem. We need to fix that. I'm trying to make that happen, but it takes money to change those things. Anyway, these are the kinds of things we have to think about. So prayer. Charity, giving. Muslims are commanded to give a certain portion of their income to the needy. This is a positive commandment. It is expected that if you believe in Allah, you should share your wealth with other people. You understand that your wealth is not your own. It was given to you by God, and you owe some of it to others as well. And that is something shared by many religious faiths. Number 4, fasting in the month of Ramadan. So Ramadan is a month in which Muslims do not eat from sun up to sundown, or drink from sun up to sundown. And right now, it's kind of a drag to be Muslim because, I mean, not in general, but specifically because Ramadan is falling during the summer right now. And so that means that the day runs from 5:30 a.m. until 10 o'clock at night. Because Islam rigorously follows the lunar calendar, Ramadan migrates around the year. It goes a few days in the same direction every single year. So sometimes it's in the winter, sometimes it's in the summer. Right now it's in the summer. And so another thing to think about with Muslim students, making sure that you're simply aware that they may be hungry, tired, hangry, crabby in the evenings during the month of Ramadan, and just be compassionate about that. To be compassionate about that. And then finally, the fifth pillar of Islam, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim is commanded once in their life, if they are physically and financially able, to make a pilgrimage to the Kaaba, to the Grand Mosque in Mecca, to practice the Hajj. Now, I mentioned earlier Muhammad and the idea of divine revelation. One of the really central things, one of the things that makes Islam distinctive as a world tradition is the emphasis on the Quran. Now, the word Quran is from the same Semitic root that the Hebrew word for scripture, mikra, is from. And it just means recitation. And this is really important because this distinguishes Islam from Christianity and Judaism. Christians and Jews believe that their scriptures were written by humans, divinely inspired humans, but humans nonetheless. The Quran, according to Muslims, was literally dictated by Allah. It is the literal words of literal God. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. So how did he produce the Quran? Allah told him, he memorized, he told others to write. And this signifies that it comes directly from God. Muhammad didn't write it, he couldn't have. He wasn't capable of writing. He didn't write. And so the Quran has a very special status for Muslims, a status that is greater even than the Bible for Christians, because it is the literal dictation, the literal recitation of the words of Allah. It's the final and most important revelation of Allah to humans, and it is supposed to guide human life. And so that means that copies of the Quran have to be treated with great care. You don't throw them around. You don't put them under the short leg of the couch. You don't leave them lying around. They are expected to be treated with great care and dignity because they represent the literal words of Allah, especially if they're in Arabic. Translations as well should be respected, but the literal Arabic is the most important version. Any questions so far?
When do
Yes.
the 5 times a day, like in Central Time Zone, when do those fall?
So it's sun up and after sundown will be the 2 bookend times, and then interspersed evenly throughout the day.
Okay.
And I'm not sure exactly what times. Actually, something I like to do for my students, you can download a smartphone app that will go off 5 times a day when it's prayer time. And so the speaker will do the call to prayer, the adhan, and there's a compass on it so that you can figure out which way is Mecca, so that you can orient your body. But yeah, students will know what time it is, and as a professor, I let students know, like, if you need to get up and pray, just like, I'll know what you're doing. Just go ahead and do that. That's cool. Let me know what you need. Yeah. Other questions? Yes,
How long
please.
does that prayer time usually last?
Just a few minutes. It's short. It's a short prayer. Friday afternoon, there's usually a short, like half-hour to hour-long prayer service where prayer is combined with a short sermon from the imam and some social interaction. But otherwise, it's very short. Very short. Yes?
Are there specific prayers they say, or do they have a choice?
It's a recitation. The prayer is recited. I don't know. I think that most would also have their own private prayers, but there is a liturgical prayer that people go through. In that sense, it's very similar to Judaism. Other questions? Okay, let's talk about a couple other things. I think I'm okay on, I'm good on time. Let's keep moving on. So I always like to do this because many Americans have this stereotype of Islam as a violent religion, of Islam as a bloodthirsty religion, a harsh religion. And so I often ask my students to do this, and I'm going to ask you to do this as well. So thank you in advance for being game for this project. One of these quotations is from the Christian Bible. One of these quotations is from the Quran, and I often ask my students to try to figure out which is which. So take a couple of minutes and just read over these, and I'll ask you maybe to vote on which one is which, okay, in like 2 minutes. Take a second and read. And let me get out of your way. So, who thinks the one on your left is the Quran? Who thinks the one on the right is the Quran? Okay. You're right. So I'd like to point out, this is part of the Christian Bible. Idolaters will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed in the cup of his anger, and they'll be tormented with the fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels, and the smoke of their torment will go up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for idolaters. That's from the book of Isaiah, which is shared by Jews and Christians as scripture. And I don't do that to say that Islam is somehow better, but that violence is not unique to Islam. Another example, warfare. One of these is from the Quran, one is from the Christian Bible, different regulations on how to practice warfare. So here on the left, we read, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they repent, if they turn back and perform the prayer and give alms, let them go their way. Truly, God is forgiving and merciful. On the right, when you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then the people shall serve you as forced laborers, slaves. If they do not submit peacefully but make war, besiege it, and when God gives it to you, put all its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, livestock, everything else in the town, all of its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which God has given to you. So in one case, we get slay the idolaters, but if they repent, they can be one of you. On the other hand, we get attack. If they surrender, enslave them. If they don't, slaughter them, and take the women and children as possessions. And you're probably not surprised to know, this is from the Quran. The Christian Bible, and I'm a Christian myself, the Christian Bible actually teaches in a couple of places straight up genocide. The complete and wholesale slaughter of entire populations because they are on the promised land given to the children of Israel. And that's a real problem that Christians have to think about how to understand and how to practice in their lives, because that's not okay. Muslims also have violent texts that they have to deal with. And what I always emphasize to my students is this: practitioners of a religion have a choice about what to do with their violent texts. There are certainly Muslims who take the violent text literally and prioritize them over the compassionate ones. There are also Christians who take the violent text literally and prioritize them over the compassionate ones. I live in Topeka. I live about 5 minutes from Westboro Baptist Church. I'm aware of Christians who take the violent text literally and prioritize them over the compassionate ones. People have a choice. Muslims have a choice. And most Muslims choose the compassionate and the peaceful and the livable teachings over the violent ones. A couple more things. So a lot of times I have students who want to know about Sharia. We hear a lot of talk in America about Sharia law, about Muslims trying to impose Sharia in America, trying to make America Muslim. And I just want to offer some clarifications about what Sharia is. So Sharia is Muslim religious law. And it literally means the right path, or the right way. You might hear people say sometimes that Islam doesn't separate religion from other aspects of life, from politics, from culture, from everything else. And so Sharia is all-encompassing. Sharia deals not only with private ethical obligations, but also public issues like government and things like that. And that's right. That's actually right. Islam does not distinguish religion from politics in and of itself. However, one of the key dictates of Sharia is that, I think I have this on the slide here, it stipulates that Muslims must obey the civil law. So Muslims who live in Muslim countries, sometimes those countries actually have Sharia as the law of the land. Saudi Arabia, a good example of a Muslim country that practices Sharia as part of law. But Islam teaches if you're a Muslim and you live in a non-Muslim country, you obey the civic law first. You do not try to change that country's laws to reflect Sharia. And as far as you can practice Sharia, or as long as you can obey civil law without breaking Sharia, you do that. So for example, in the United States, American Muslims find very little dissonance between the private practice of Sharia as the way of ordering their lives as Muslims and the public, civil, secular law of the United States of America. And so there really is no reason for concern about this. American Muslims in particular have no interest in trying to change American laws to reflect Islam. what they want is the same as what anybody wants, which is to live their lives unmolested, unharassed, and live peacefully and prosper and take care of their families and things like that. And so you may have heard the term fatwa. Oftentimes in the West we associate fatwas with death sentences because that's what we hear about them. The word fatwa just means a legal ruling. So when a Muslim has a question about how to practice Sharia, they look for a fatwa. And you get a fatwa from an ulama, from a legal scholar. And if you live someplace where you have a legal scholar in your town, that's easy. You go to the legal scholar, you present your case, I have this problem, you get a fatwa, a ruling, and that's what you do. In America, many Muslims don't have access to that, so there are online resources where you can get fatwas. So it says here, click for a fatwa. You go to the website, you click, and you type your case in. It goes off to a legal scholar, an ulama, and you get a fatwa back. And that is how Sharia applies to your life in that circumstance. One more thing, and then I'm going to take some questions about Islam, and then we'll talk about Buddhism. One more thing. So different ways of dress in the Muslim world for Muslim women. So many of you are probably aware that Muslim women often wear head coverings. There are different terms for these head coverings. I'm going to talk about what some of those are, okay? So the covering that goes across the entire face, that reveals only the eyes. This is typical of women from Saudi Arabia. Washburn has a number of Saudi students. The Saudi women tend to wear the niqab that covers everything but their eyes. But other Muslim women would wear, especially in the US, just the hijab, which is just a scarf that goes over the head and covers most of the hair. And in fact, if you go online, do this, in fact, if you want to, Teen Vogue, the magazine Teen Vogue, has an absolutely spectacular video on how to rock a hijab. And they have several different young American Muslim women talk about how they incorporate their hijab into their fashion. And so a couple of things about the way that Muslim women sometimes dress. The first thing is this. In most countries, the hijab, the chador, and the niqab are voluntary. They're not required. You don't have to wear them. They are a choice people make. So American Muslim women who wear the hijab, who wear the niqab, do that voluntarily. And many of them will say they do that because it makes them feel closer to God, closer to their religion. It makes them feel, they'll often say that it makes them feel empowered and dignified, which goes completely against the way that many Westerners stereotype the hijab and the niqab. That is not mandated by the Quran. All that the Quran says about dress for both men and women is that it should be modest. And that word modest is left up to personal interpretation. The particular kind of head coverings that women often wear have more to do with the culture of Arabia than with anything stipulated by the religion itself. And I'm not saying that there aren't places and contexts in which women are forced to wear, so like Iran, for instance, requires by law that women wear a hijab at least to cover their hair. But that in most cases, women choose to dress in the way that they dress because it's how they want to practice their Islam. So what questions do you have? What comments do you have about Islam? And then I want to talk about Buddhism for a little bit. I've got to 3:45 or 3:15, right?
3:30.
Okay, great.
How does
Yes.
a woman, okay, first of all with the burqa,
Uh-huh.
are their hands covered too?
That's really, who's heard of henna? Henna is a form of art, body art, in many Muslim majority countries. The hands are not usually covered. I don't know with the burqa. I think with the burqa as well, the hands are not covered. And so a lot of times women who wear the chador, which is the covering that covers the whole body, will often decorate their hands with beautiful decorations because it's the one part of their body that they can show. And so that is a common form of that, yeah.
And how do they eat? With
The burqa,
shove it under there, or
no, I think the expectation is that they would only be eating in private. So when a woman is at home, when a woman is among her male relatives or only women, she doesn't have to cover up. She only has to cover up if she's in public. And so the effect of this is to make it more cumbersome for women to exist in public. So like a woman who wants to order a Happy Meal or whatever, like that's a problem if you were required to wear the burqa. I didn't talk about the burqa because that really is only worn in a few places in the world. And it tends to be in places where it's required, like, Afghanistan under the Taliban, and in places like that. But yeah, it definitely hindered certain public interactions that women have to engage in. And the idea then is to limit things like eating, which is a social activity, of course, to the private sphere where you don't have to wear the thing. Good questions. What else?
Not so much a question, it's
Yeah.
a comment.
Yes, please.
I've had this discussion with other people. A lot of people say this is extremely oppressive,
Mhm.
and are trying to ban it in certain places.
I know.
And the fact of it is, thinking on the lines of it allows them to be judged more
Mhm.
on the context of their character, rather than how you look. Trying to get above because of how you present yourself. And then with some of them, it is a choice. It's not so much required of them. And so I've kind of gotten arguments with people before. It's no different than like very Orthodox Catholic nuns who are required to cover as well. It's not very different.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important to keep in mind, and this goes up directly off of what you said, that different women experience these things differently. That for some women, perhaps in some contexts, it would be not a personal choice, it would be oppressive. And I know when you hear stories of women who live in countries where it's legally required, they will say that it's repressive. But in other cases, it's not. And I think that for me as a scholar of religion, as a male scholar of religion, it's really important to me to listen to what people say about their own practice. To not assume that, because I'm a Western, liberated, woke feminist, that I know that wearing a veil is oppressive. I don't. I should talk to you about that and find out how you feel about your veil before I say anything about that. And so again, I'm not making blanket judgments about whether these are oppressive or liberating. It's really relative to the individual and how they experience it. You're right that for some women, it might be a way to transcend, for instance, Western ideals of beauty. To not be judged immediately by your looks and your sexual appeal, which is necessary. I mean, it's just an inherent part of a sexualized patriarchal culture like the United States. Yeah. What else? Yes.
When taken out of their culture, I often wonder how they feel when they see traditional American dress, and especially on a college campus, where you might be dressed like that, and then you see the way, especially on a really, really hot day in the summer, what other females dress like, and then what is the male reaction when all day long through their whole lives women look like that, and yet they come to Kansas State and all of a sudden there's a lot more to see.
Yeah. Well,
How do they deal with that?
I can't speak for Muslim men. I can say that there's a range of reactions, and the reactions look a great deal like the reactions of American, of white boys from America, in that they respond in different ways, and some of that is related to their hormones, and some of that is related to their upbringing. So people who are from very conservative Christian backgrounds would probably also feel some dissonance seeing, skin. So a bit of my background, I went to Oklahoma Baptist University, a Southern Baptist University, and I remember hearing sermons at the mandatory chapel about dressing modestly. And those were always directed at women, of course. The women had to dress modestly. And it's the same ideology that men can't control their sexuality, and that so women have to dress modestly to protect the men from themselves. And so I think that mentality is shared between Christians and Muslims from certain shared kinds of backgrounds. So again, I can't speak for how Muslim men experience it. I know that many Muslims don't like the libertine nature of American culture. They think that America is over-sexualized. At the same time, if you ever watch Pakistani soap operas, they're also pretty heavily sexualized. And so this is not the unique province of the West or the United States. Egyptian pop culture is also very heavily sexualized in ways that look similar to American pop culture. So there's a lot more continuity than we expect between Islam and Christianity, between America and Muslim majority cultures along those lines. Does that get at your... Thank you. Yes. And then you had a question or a comment.
I was trying to remember something that I read about France banning the scarf.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can only imagine how Muslims would feel not being able to wear, their clothing of their desire.
Yeah, and I mean, recently the big thing in France has been the ban on what's called the burkini. Who's heard of burkinis? So the burkini is a form of swimwear that Muslim women have developed to be able to go to the beach, because of course, as people who believe in modesty, who believe in the need to cover themselves, they don't want to wear Western-style swimsuits, but, France is hot. They want to go to the beach. So the burkini is essentially a swimsuit that is a unitard that covers, from the wrist to the ankles, and then it has a water-resistant headscarf that covers the hair. It looks kind of like a scuba suit. And France has either attempted or has successfully banned the burkini because they regard it as oppressive to women. And this relates to the relation. This is something I often say, that the United States has typically had an extraordinarily peaceful relationship with American Muslims. American Muslims are very well integrated to American culture. American Muslims, despite the fact that they experience hate crimes at a growing rate in American culture, tend to be very patriotic, very positive about America, very comfortable living in America. Europe, there's a lot more tension. And that relates both to the fact that there's a larger Muslim minority, and I think it relates also to the fact that French countries, or not French, but European countries are nation states, where there's an assumption that French culture is a unified thing. Whereas America has more of a flexibility around cultural assimilation, since there's not one ethnicity that defines Americanness. But yeah, there have been attempts in many countries to ban the burqa, to ban the niqab, and I can tell you my personal opinion. I think it's very wrong to do that. I mean, I'm an American. I believe in religious liberty, and if your religion leads you to cover your head, cover your head.
How's it they can get away with banning something that is innately, a choice for religious?
Yeah, I don't have enough of depth there to make a strong statement about why the logic. I know that the understanding is both that it's oppressive to the assumption is that women don't choose it. It's oppressive to them, and so they don't want women to be forced into that by their families. And again, you can't judge that. You can't assume that. And also the idea that it perpetuates a violent culture. I think, again, that is making a blanket assumption about Islam that is inappropriate.
Some of them think it's because it's hard to tell whether it's male or female underneath there, and whether or not, it's friendly or an enemy.
Yeah.
For security reasons, a lot of them is
Yeah.
what they're using. The underlying reason is that
Yeah.
they're trying to ban it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, that seems like way too blunt an instrument for whatever security it produces. Yeah. Let me go ahead and move on to Buddhism. I want to make sure and talk about Buddhism, and then we have some more time for Q&A at the end, okay? So, Buddhism is very different from Islam, from Christianity. And one way in which many forms of Buddhism are completely different is that some forms of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism in particular, are atheistic. They have no God. There is no belief in God in many forms of Buddhism. Some forms of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, believe that some Buddhas have become deified, but ultimately there is no deity. There's no personal God who created the universe in Buddhism. Buddhism assumes that ultimate reality is essentially an illusion. And Westerners have a terrible time wrapping their minds around this. And we're not going to do that in 15 minutes, but I want to give you an introduction to Buddhist thought to get a sense of what that's like. So Buddhism begins with a great story, the story of Gautama Siddhartha, the first Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. He was an Indian, like South Asian Indian, and what we call a Hindu, although that term is somewhat of a misnomer. And according to legend, and some of this is historical, some of it is not, he was from a spectacularly wealthy family. And his father decided that he wanted to give his son, Gautama Siddhartha, a perfect life. So he didn't let him see anything negative. He kept him in the palace and did not allow him to see people who were old, people who were sick, people who were infirm, or people who had died. And so he grew up not knowing anything about suffering. He had never encountered suffering before. And so according to legend, according to the foundation myth of Buddhism, Gautama Siddhartha, finally as an adult, was taken on a carriage ride, and he got to see these things in the world. He saw a man who was sick. He saw a dead body. He saw infirmity. He saw old age. And he had no way to process it, and so he was deeply scarred by the experience. And so he renounced his life, he renounced his inheritance as king, and he went out in a quest to find answers to these questions. And according to legend, he first tried renouncing everything, starving himself, becoming a monk, renouncing the world, and for 6 years he did that and didn't get anywhere, didn't find himself more enlightened, found that he was not any happier. So finally, he did this kind of American thing to do, really. He sat himself in front of a tree and decided he would meditate until he either died or figured it out. And after 39 days of fighting with a demon, meditating, he came to the ultimate truths, the Four Noble Truths that Buddhism teaches. And I want to talk about those for a minute, okay? So the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism are as follows. The first thing that the Buddha discovered is that there is suffering. Da-da-da-da, Captain Obvious. But no, there is profundity to this. He insists that to live is to suffer. Human life is inextricably bound up with suffering. You cannot live without suffering. Suffering is what defines our existence in the world. And so that's the first noble truth, to realize, to understand that suffering is unavoidable, that suffering is part of being alive. You cannot live without suffering. The second noble truth is that suffering has a cause. Not only is suffering ubiquitous, but we can identify where suffering comes from. And according to the Buddha, according to Gautama Siddhartha, suffering is rooted in desire. We suffer because we want what we cannot have. And that's not just, like it's the holiday season. We just had Black Friday. We're being inundated with ads. Like, there are ads about people, like, buying Lexuses for Christmas, and, like, I can barely afford to buy food for Christmas. So we are inundated with images of things we can't have. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that. It's not just material wealth. Think about relationships. Probably the greatest source of joy in human life is relationships with other human beings, connections with other human beings, with family, with friends, with spouses, with loved ones, with children. Every single person you have ever loved will die someday. And before they die, they will change. And those changes may take them farther from you, and that hurts. So even the highest joys of our existence in this world are marked and defined by suffering. Suffering is unavoidable. And so the Buddha says that suffering is caused by desire. It's caused by these things that we want. Not necessarily bad things that we want, but the fact that we want. We will always want what we cannot have. The good news, though, according to the Buddha, is that if suffering has a cause, suffering has an end. If suffering is caused by desire, how do you end suffering? By not desiring. That's the easy part, knowing that you just have to snuff out desire and you can stop suffering. The hard part is doing it. And that's the fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth of Buddhism is that you can, in fact, end suffering. Humans have the power to end suffering. And the way is what is known as the middle path, or the Eightfold Path. So what the truth that the Buddha discovered, that he then shares with humanity, and you can do with it what you want. Buddhism is not a compulsory religion, but it is an evangelical religion. It does try to spread the good news to other people, is that by practicing the middle path, by not renouncing the world entirely, but by renouncing gradually the things that you want and need in this world, you can eventually attain enlightenment. You can eventually free yourself from suffering, from desire, from the cycle of birth and death and rebirth in the world. You can achieve nirvana, which is essentially a blowing out, the complete absence and loss of your individuality, your personhood, your existence, essentially becoming one with everything. And Westerners, again, have a really hard time with that, because Christianity, Islam, Judaism all teach a personal afterlife. Like, you die, and you, who you are, you go to heaven, and you're with God and your friends for all of eternity. You don't ever lose who you are, according to Christianity and every Abrahamic faiths. Buddhism teaches that yourself is an illusion. You don't really exist. And you have to realize that. You have to recognize that. You have to understand that deep down inside, that you are an illusion. Everything you are is an illusion. And once you realize that, once you free yourself from that, you can end suffering. You can stop desiring. You can live this life of inner peace. So that is sort of the standard textbook version of Buddhism. And when I was teaching a world religions class a couple of years ago, I had a Vietnamese student in my class. And I got through with exactly the spiel I just gave you. And she raised her hand. And Vietnam is a Buddhist majority country. I mean, it has been communist, so it was officially atheistic, but most Vietnamese are also Buddhist. And she explained that doesn't sound anything at all like what Buddhism is like for her. Like, I'm a Buddhist, and I don't do any, like, I don't meditate. I'm not trying to achieve nirvana. we light candles, and we offer gifts to local gods, and we pray to our ancestors. That's Buddhism for her. So I want to real briefly sort of end on this note, talking about the gap between the textbook version of Buddhism and actual lived Buddhism. So here on your left is a Buddhist shrine, a household shrine that you would expect to see in many Buddhist houses, especially in Mahayana majority countries like Vietnam and China. And so at the household shrine, the idea is that you would offer puja, you would offer a sacrificial meal to a Buddha that you recognize as having a connection to you. So the idea within Mahayana Buddhism is this: people who achieve nirvana stop short of it because they're so compassionate, they care so much. So the idea is that I sacrifice, I meditate, I practice the middle path, I reach enlightenment. And before that final moment when I pass on into enlightenment, I stop. And I come back to the world so that I can help others get there as well. And so for Mahayana Buddhists, lighting candles and offering puja to bodhisattvas, to Buddhas who have stopped short of enlightenment, is a way of bettering your status so that when you're reborn, you can get to enlightenment yourself. For Theravada Buddhists, and that's the majority Buddhism in places like Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka, giving alms to monks or bhikkhus is how you better your status in the world. Most people don't renounce everything and become monks. Most people live ordinary lives, and you give some money, you give some food to the monks and help them along, and that is how you better your status so that you can eventually achieve enlightenment. So because Buddhism teaches these sort of noble truths that lead to the loss of the self, don't assume that people who practice Buddhism are engaged in constant meditation and self-renouncement. They probably aren't. They might be. They probably aren't. So, questions about Buddhism? Buddhism's fascinating. I honestly did not know that much about it until a couple of years ago when I started teaching world religions classes. I really want to go down that rabbit hole. Buddhism is fascinating. I think in small part because it doesn't depend on the revelation of a deity. It's not a theistic religion. Instead, it's a religion of discovery. I mean, really, what all the Buddha did was he figured out the truth and he shared it with people.
Question.
Yes.
I don't know too much about Buddhism other than, I've seen these statues of Buddha.
Yeah.
It's usually this fat little guy sitting down with their belly, and they rub their bellies for good luck or whatever.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that particular statue?
Fatness signifies prosperity. It signifies success. And so you think it's odd that a renouncer, somebody who gave up desire, would be fat. But that represents, again, this sort of combination. That's a very Mahayana form of Buddha. And so the idea is that he got to the point of enlightenment. And so fatness is a way of signifying success and good fortune. It makes you happy to be fat. Other questions?
I have a question,
Yes.
but not about food.
Okay.
So, as far as you know, is there another religion where that God, their name is taken in vain? Like Christians, a lot of people, Jesus Christ, or God's name, or anything like that. Is there any other religion that you're aware of that they...
I think that's pretty common. Because divine names are sources of power. And I mean, the reason for that commandment, not taking the Lord's name in vain, is not, because you slam your finger with a hammer and you say the thing and whatever. It's really rooted in a magical mentality. It is that divine names have power. And if you use that cheaply, then you're invoking divine power for vain purposes, for purposes that are not okay, and that makes God angry. So this is getting into the weeds of it, but in the Bible, there's a story about Jacob. He wrestles with God. And at the end of this wrestling match, so Jacob, this biblical character, he has a wrestling match with God, and God can't beat him, so God fights dirty. God injures his hip. And so they're locked in a headlock together, and Jacob's hip is out of socket, and he's fighting with God. I swear this is in the Bible. Look it up, Genesis 32. And God is like, let me go. And Jacob's like, not till you tell me your name. And God won't tell him his name. And God won't tell Jacob his name because names are a source of power. That would give Jacob power over him. And so God won't do it. Later on, he gives Moses his name. And that's a whole other ball of wax. But yeah, names are a source of power. And so many religions have prohibitions on using divine names cheaply. Yes, in the back.
So you said that Buddhists believe that this isn't like this life isn't a reality?
It's an illusion.
Okay, how does that play with the one with the shrine in their home?
Good question. Yeah, so if I know that reality is an illusion, why would I light candles and have a shrine in my home? Here's why. There's actually an answer to that. Here's why. It is really hard to understand that life is an illusion. You can know intellectually. Like, I could decide, you know what? I'm going to convert to Buddhism. I'm going to do it right here, right now. I now believe that everything is an illusion. Like, that's not an illusion. My knuckles hurt. Like, the gap between professing the idea and in your gut knowing that it's an illusion is different. So when you read memoirs written by people who practice Buddhism, they'll talk about through meditation, through like years, decades of meditative practice, you begin to perceive your body as illusory. You begin to perceive reality as illusory. And so that's what it is. Most people don't do that. Most people don't have time to meditate 10 hours a day. They have to farm or build widgets or whatever people do to make a living. And so the idea behind the shrines is that if you don't have time to do that, you can get the help of these mini-Buddhas, these bodhisattvas, to help you along. So that eventually you can get to a life stage, a rebirth, where you can be a monk, where you can meditate, where you can finally achieve enlightenment. That was a fantastic question. Thank you. What else? Yes?
There's sound advice that one shouldn't discuss politics or religion with other people. And you're not a political scientist, so you don't find yourself doing a lot of that, I'm assuming.
No, religion is so intrinsically tied to politics, I can't get away from it.
Well, your profession is to discuss religion.
Yes.
Do you have interesting moments in classes where people really clash with your ideas and, for whatever reason?
Not often, and that's because I've become very careful about creating classroom environments where we don't clash, where instead we discuss. And so I make it very clear that students can express their ideas, where students can ask questions. And I make it very clear that my ideas are not doctrine. My ideas are conclusions I've reached as a professional, but they're open to debate, absolutely. And generally, my students want to ask questions. They want to challenge certain ideas. I don't find that debate is helpful in the classroom. Never get into a power struggle with a student. Nothing good comes of a power struggle with a student. Engage. Converse, discuss, try to make everything constructive. Try to make it that we are trying together to find better knowledge. That's what I try to go by. But yeah, this is 2017 United States of America. You can't say anything without it being political. You can't. So, I'm going to be political. You have to be political. This morning when the president, retweeted 3 videos by a fascist group from Britain about Muslims. You can't talk about religion in America without being political right now. And so, yeah, we just have to dive in. It's worth doing. It's important to do. It's very hard in Kansas, though, because Kansas is so nice. I think part of the reason students don't argue is that they're enculturated not to argue. If you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything. And it's really difficult to build a classroom environment where students begin to feel like they can ask the questions they want to ask and say the things they really think. Because they're good people, and they have ideas that are very bad sometimes. And that needs to come out in the open for you to be able to talk about it. So that's a lot of the work of teaching in 2017 in America.
I think people are just kind of what they don't know, and that's why they choose to act out in violence.
Yeah. Most people are very good people, but ignorance makes us scared, and fear makes us horrible. And to me, the work of the liberal arts is reducing ignorance and thereby fear. I hope it works. Are there other questions? I think we're at 3:30, so I don't want to keep you any longer. I'm on your clock, Michelle, so.
Oh, you're good. Yeah.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yes, please.
It may be a personal question, so if you choose not to answer, that's fine. But you said that you went to a Baptist college.
I did.
Okay. So as you're through your course of study, did you find yourself questioning your own beliefs?
Oh, absolutely.
And contextualizing them with things that you learned?
I was that student. I took a sociology of religion class my junior year of college, and I'm still unraveling the questions that I discovered there. Because what I learned in that class was that the things that I thought were unique to Christianity showed up elsewhere in other religions. They had the same category. So like Christians have Jesus. Jesus is God incarnate. Jesus is God in the flesh. Jesus is the final distinct revelation of God. Islam has that category as well. It's not a person for Islam. Muhammad is not like Jesus for Islam. Do you know what is like Jesus in Islam? The Quran. The Quran is the worldly incarnation of God himself. And so Muslims treat the Quran in the way that Christians treat Jesus, and realize that understanding that those categories cross boundaries, I'm still unraveling the implications of that. So yeah, absolutely. And I don't have the answers. I always say, like, I'm not a theologian, I'm a scholar of religion. Theological questions are above my pay grade. My questions, does God exist? Does God want me to be happy? I can't answer those. Those are philosophical questions. I study how people do religion. Yeah. Yes?
In a court of law, if someone isn't Christian and doesn't believe in the Bible, do they still have to put their hand on the Bible and say, I solemnly swear, blah, blah, blah?
They do not. They can choose whatever they want to swear on. So, for instance, when Keith Ellison, a Muslim congressman from Minnesota, was sworn into the House of Representatives, he swore on a Quran. I believe he swore on Jefferson's Quran. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. But yeah, Muslims would swear on the Quran, not the Bible. I don't know what atheists or agnostics choose. Maybe anything. I don't honestly know. I've never sworn in a court of law. But yeah, and that's what's weird about America. Like, I love America because America's so weird. Like, the First Amendment stipulates freedom of religion. Congress should make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. And yet, religion is everywhere in America. And Christianity is everywhere in American government, even though it's not explicitly called Christianity. And so that makes it very... This is a whole other topic, so forgive me for even bringing this up, but American civil religion, the idea that, like, there's a God who believes in justice, like, in God we trust, on the money, and so on, that's breaking down. Because we're seeing, instead of this general consensus around everybody believes in God and then they do their own religious thing in private, we're breaking off into secularity on the one hand and Christian fundamentalism on the other. And those two groups have less and less and less of a vocabulary to talk to each other. It's a great frustration because I teach, at Washburn University. Most of my students are Christian. Many of them are evangelical Christian. And trying to find a vocabulary for them to talk about other religions in a secular way at a secular institution is a great challenge. And it's not because they're not wonderful people. It's that our cultures are divided. It's a problem that America's going to have to figure out how to solve, I think. So that was not what you asked about, but I got on my stuff.
This is just kind of an off-wall question, but not trying to have you point one out or anything, but in your study of world religions, all world religions, do you ever come across one that you just, oh, those folks are out there?
Those folks are out
They're like I said, not asking for any choice.
There is some forms of mysticism that get into pretty crazy territory. You read some early Jewish apocalypses. There's just some bonkers stuff, beasts with 4 heads and 7 eyes and 10 horns, and the horns yell at you. That's actually in the Christian Bible, but it's like this little slice of Jewish lore. The book of Ezekiel. Oh man, you get to Ezekiel stuff. Who's heard of there's aliens in Ezekiel? That's what like after 3 drinks your uncle said to you at Thanksgiving. You've heard there's aliens in Ezekiel, right? I get that all the time. I once had a guy fall asleep with my arm on an airplane. But before that, he told me all about aliens in Ezekiel. When I fly, I'm always an accountant. I'm never a scholar. Every single time. There are all the communities that have these very esoteric beliefs. And for me, the idea that, oh, that's bizarre, that's your first impulse. But then the thing I want to do as a scholar of religion, how do I explain that? What leads a person to adopt beliefs that are so out there from my perspective? What social conditions, what personal inclinations lead somebody to adopt things that are out there that make them pariahs within American culture? Yeah. Yes, in the back.
So this might be a tough question, but I'm just curious.
Okay.
But, so the recent attacks in Europe and things like that. So what do radical Islam believe? What are their fundamentals out there acting out in this way?
So radical political Islam, what we see in ISIS, what we see in Al Qaeda, we see in terrorist organizations that make attacks in Europe and the United States, are committed to the idea that Islam was perfect in the 7th century, and they need to go back there. And so they need to recreate what Islam was like during the life of the Prophet and shortly thereafter. So what they're trying to do is recreate the caliphate. And the caliphate is the idea of Muslim rule over Muslim territories, over the Middle East and other areas around there. And so what they're attempting to do, and this is part of, this gets me into politics again, part of the reason that I think that the recent surge of white nationalism is so dangerous, the reason they make these attacks in Europe is in part to make Europe and America intolerable for Muslims. They want Muslims to feel like they have to move back to Muslim majority countries in order to live. And so, part of, frankly, my honest opinion as a scholar is that, when politicians in Western countries attempt to crack down on Islam, attempt to make Muslims uncomfortable, they're playing directly into ISIS's hands, because they are taking this part of the world where it's very good to be a Muslim in America and making it less so. But yeah, what they want to do is reestablish Muslim political control of Muslim territories. And that's their agenda. And so that's what they're attempting to do. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay,
And then
good.
What can we do, like, as you were saying, like it plays right into their hands.
Yeah.
So like, what can we do to make them feel comfortable?
I think the first thing is to understand just how small a percentage of Muslims in the world are members of any organization like that or are sympathetic to it. I mean, even in places, like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, where a large number of rural people, largely because of ignorance and fear, that's just unfamiliar, are sympathetic toward these political forms of Islam. Even that represents a very small minority of Muslims worldwide. And it's important to remember, too, that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of victims of terrorism by Muslims are Muslims. Just last week in Egypt, over 300 people were murdered in an Egyptian mosque by other Muslims. The level of danger that Americans in Kansas face for radical Islam is infinitesimal. Just infinitesimal. It's so tiny, it's not even worth mentioning. It's so very, very, very tiny. You're much more likely to get gunned down by a lone white dude here than you are by a Muslim terrorist. Seriously, like statistically. That's much more likely to happen to you in the United States of America. And so I think that politically targeting Muslims in America is exactly the wrong approach. And you probably have sussed out my politics by now. I'll say this about George W. Bush. He always did a very good job of making it clear that the United States was not at war with Islam, that American Muslims were Americans, and that the United States had a problem with terrorism, not with Islam. And I feel like that distinction has been lost in many political parts of American rhetoric. And I mean Republicans, by the way. Sorry. Not like all Republicans, but like that party has adopted a much more anti-Islamic perspective, I think in a way that is dangerous. And again, I'm not saying who to vote for, but I'm naming that as something that I think is dangerous and wrong-headed.
Question.
Yes.
So these so-called lone wolf Muslim extremist terrorists who drive their cars into crowds, what are they trying to accomplish?
They often are, these are almost always young men, almost always unemployed, almost always rootless, and they get pulled into these groups. So ISIS is very, very good at recruiting online. They produce these awesome, like high production value, not your grandmother's Al-Qaeda videos, promotion videos that tell this story of Muslims standing courageously against the incursions of the West and of finding. So if you're a young alienated Muslim man who spends a lot of time playing video games in a basement in suburban Paris or whatever, and I mean I have students, white students who are like this, who are alienated, angry, disaffected, resentful, feel like the world's rejected and the world's against them. I can totally see them getting pulled into anybody who said, here's a way to make your life valuable. Here's a way to get back at the haters. Here's a way to do something of meaning with your life. Give it up. And within Islam, there is a strong ideology of martyrdom, to die for Islam, and not to kill for Islam, to die for Islam, is a very, very high and mighty thing to do. It guarantees access to paradise, not the City to Virgin stuff, that's mostly myth, but it does guarantee paradise. Like to die for Islam, to be a martyr for Islam, to die for your faith, just like with Christianity, is a highly validated and valorized thing to do. And so ISIS uses that rhetoric to convince people. And I mean, you don't have to get that many. They probably send this stuff out to millions of people. If 3 of them act on it, it shuts down a city for a day. It's on the news cycle for 2 weeks. The president tweets about it, and we're banning people from 7 countries. Like, it doesn't take much. You don't have to do that much to get people riled up. And I'll say this too, and this actually goes back to your question as well. Terrorism kills people, and that's terrible. Like, it's terrible that people die in terrorist attacks. The real danger of terrorism is getting a country to overreact to it, to politically commit itself to things that hurt it in the long run out of irrational fear of that terrorism. So like San Bernardino is, what 20 some odd Americans were shot and killed by these two who were motivated by ISIS to act. That's horrible, and I'm deeply saddened by the loss of these people. Making policy to prevent that kind of attack is bad policy, because it ultimately plays into the hands of the terrorist organizations by creating this cross-cultural conflict where there really isn't one.
Then I had a question
Yes.
too, because I can't remember, I've heard about it before, there's like two different names, like you said, dying for Islam versus killing in the name of Islam. I know there's two different names, there's one, it's jihad, and I can't remember what the other one's called.
I don't know the other. Jihad is a word that is very often misunderstood. There are different dimensions.
They actually teach not to kill.
Yeah, the Quran legislates warfare. It acknowledges the reality of warfare and it tries to regulate them. It never says that it's a positive, good thing to kill people. It's necessary sometimes. So there is that distinction. Jihad is another word that is often misunderstood. Within conventional Muslim thought, jihad is primarily a spiritual battle. It's the struggle to control yourself, to live a good life, to not sin, and instead to do what is righteous. You practice jihad within your own life to be righteous. Political Islam has adopted that term and turned it into actual external warfare. And most American Muslims would regard that as illegitimate, or at least as not the primary use of that term. I don't want to keep anybody who needs to go. I also don't want to stop until y'all have had your questions answered. So what should we do?
I think that
Do you want to formally dismiss and then I'll stick around?
Yeah,
Okay,
and then if you want to ask me more questions, you can ask him for as long as you can stay.
Okay.
But if we want to give Chris a big round of applause,